started. So we'll do a quick round robin introductions. We have a few minutes, 10 to 15 minutes of a quick presentation to give you an overview on what we're defining today and sharing about the new evidence-defined framework that has been published in the Nature Digital Medicine. And then we have fantastic panel discussion with some of the experts, and then we'll dive into audience Q&A. So with that, let me go ahead and unshare my screen and start with a quick introductions of our speakers today. I'll go in the order. Jordan, do you want to kick us off and introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Smits. And thanks to the Digital Medicine Society for the opportunity to present. It's been such a privilege collaborating with Team Dime on the development of the evidence-defined framework. For those I've not met, I'm Jordan Silverman, a Director of Clinical Analytics and Research in the Office of Medical Policy and Technology Assessment within Elevance Health. And by training, I'm an MD PhD, and I co-direct the Digital Health Evidence Committee within Elevance. We perform rigorous, rapid, standardized clinical evidence assessments to inform product adoption decisions in digital health. And our North Star in that work is always the health outcomes for our 45 million members. I know we've got healthcare decision makers in our audience, and we think that some of you may find this new framework, the evidence-defined framework, very useful to find digital health products that may be most likely to deliver real clinical value amidst the sea of digital health products available. And I know we also have digital health solutions providers in the audience, and we're confident that today's session will help that group refine evidence generation strategies. So I'm very excited for the discussion, and with that, let me turn it over to Dr. Paul Wicks.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the intro, Jordan. So yeah, my name's Paul Wicks. I'm a neuropsychologist by training. So my specialty was in ALS, or motor neuron disease. And for about the last 20 years, I've been working in digital health. So first of all, in academia, running online support communities for people with motor neuron disease. And then for 13 years, I was the head of research and development at a little company called Patients Like Me over in the US. And during that time, we published over 110 manuscripts in the literature, but I have to say a little bit of it was blind. I didn't quite know how much evidence we needed to produce. To some extent, it was if we kept on hearing questions from clients, well, how much bias does your data have? Well, I'd just keep publishing papers until handing them the papers would stop that particular question from coming in, and then when a new question in a new direction. So I think what I was really lacking from that perspective was someone who's commissioning research, managing the budgets, prioritizing, but it was also someone who does a lot of work in publishing. I sit on the board of 5 journals and do a lot of peer reviewing. How much evidence is enough? And you will know the cry of every scientist: more research is needed. But equally, when we work in, say, startups or payer ecosystems or whatever, we don't have an infinite amount of time, we don't have an infinite amount of resources, and we all want to prioritize the best outcomes for our service users and for our patients. So yeah, my interest in working on this, other than the opportunity to work with the dream team and having seen so many great outputs from Dime, was really to sort of say, well, you know, we could have a structured framework that would work for many stakeholders to understand that this level of evidence gets you this level of entry, and, you know, understanding, you know, both the degree to which adhering to good scientific principles could be worth it in the long term, but also to understand how much is enough for the age and stage at which a digital health provider might be. So yeah, really excited to be here. And whilst we're popcorning it over, why don't I throw over to my colleague, Tim Campolone, to speak next.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Really excited to be here and happy to have been able to contribute to all of this. So I'm Tim Campolone. I lead our translational science team at Wobot Health, and really what that means is kind of sitting at that intersection of clinical and product development, and have the privilege to kind of work across our evidence generation spectrum from the earliest stage discovery projects, which are really kind of rough and ready, rapid prototyping of ideas and concepts that we are interested in understanding and unpacking and exploring more, that then informs kind of the generation of product requirements, and then subsequently what gets built into Wobot and put into later stage evidence generation. And I come to Wobot Health having been, I guess, a veteran of several digital therapeutics companies. So started my career at Pear, and then later went to Click Therapeutics, working in similar capacities. And so I think my interest in collaboration with this group, beyond, as everyone's saying, just getting to work with some esteemed colleagues, was really thinking about the role that evidence plays across the spectrum of product development as we're starting in early stage development, about exploring things, what are the evidence needs there and the standards, and as we kind of move across that gradient, how that changes. And then thinking about, so much of my work has been thinking about how we build products for our end users and who the people are going to be using these products are. And just some of the confusion that I've heard directly from users about how do they know which products to trust, and how do they know which ones have gotten the right level of review and the right level of thoughtfulness in the design and evaluation. So having more consistent standards in place allows, I think, all of us to do a better job on the kind of development and dissemination side, but also for people receiving this information. How do they know what they can trust, and certainly what things they should be using as they try to integrate this into their own lives, or as we try to integrate this into the context of clinical care. So really excited to be here, looking forward to the discussion, and just grateful for the ability to participate. And I'll hand it off to Dr. Jenna Carl.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, pleasure to be here. Equally privileged to be among this group of great clinical researchers. So I'm Jenna Carl. I'm the Chief Medical Officer at Big Health. And as many of you will know, Big Health is from the beginning been just very committed to rigorous clinical research and evidence. And that big part of the reason for that is because one of our co-founders, Colin Espy, is a clinical researcher himself. And so that was sort of built into the fabric from Big Health. And then the team, as we developed, included, increasing clinical researchers like myself. In my background in particular, I'm a clinical psychologist and researcher, and my core training is in treatment development and outcomes research, which is exactly what we're doing at Big Health, and I think exactly what a lot of digital therapeutics companies are doing in the industry. And so for me, it was quite straightforward to sort of port that understanding of how we develop treatments and how we research them into a digital therapeutic setting. But what was really surprising to me, and what made me really interested in participating in a panel like this, or sorry, not even the panel, but the project itself, is that since being at Big Health in the past 7 years, and from the beginning even to now, when I go out and talk to different types of the current buyers of digital therapeutics, it is surprising how even in a very nuanced way, how misunderstood the evidence needs can be for digital therapeutics. And so I would say you see things from on the one hand, maybe not understanding that legitimate evidence needs to be collected, to on the other hand, not understanding the ways in which digital therapeutics are different from trying out new drugs, and that ultimately you don't need to start in animal models, for example, when you're talking about behavioral health interventions, or behavioral interventions, I should say. So there's really there's so much that's the same in terms of how we do clinical research, but there's enough nuanced differences, and the buyer set, the payer set is also somewhat different than for historic digital health, for historic traditional health. So there's just a lot of interesting areas for I think education and frankly building tools like this that can help bring everyone along, get everyone on the same page. So just absolutely pleased to be a part of this group and help do that. And I will pass along the mic.
Thank you, Dr. Call. And thank you everyone for joining today. I have a chicken scratch of notes that I want to dive in, but before we do that, as promised, we want to share with you some of the quick summary in the next few minutes. And I'm go ahead and share my screen across what the evidence-defined framework is that we all have been working on for the last 1.5 years and how it came down. Before we do that, just wanted to preface that we have been seeing in industry over 350,000 digital health products that are coming out. And this is growing every single day. From one of the analysis that showed that over 215 new digital health apps or various tools are out in the market. It becomes really hard for clinicians, for patients, for various different stakeholders in terms of how they differentiate it. And right now, as we think about it, a lot of clinical researchers, clinician scientists, and clinicians on calls today, it's a wild west when we think about what does the right clinical value look like? What is the right quality? We have used evidence multiple times across discussions on evidence is needed for digital health products. What's the rigor? What quality of those evidence are needed was something that we were very keen to think about and standardize across multiple stakeholders, where a team of stakeholders came together from organizations to essentially answer some of the common questions around what is that clinical assessment and clinical value underneath the digital health products and interventions that we should be looking at. So just to give you a quick overview on, as we were looking at evidence-defined framework, what we considered in scope was some of the guidelines that focused on adoption levels, because having a good evidence is great. How does it translate to an adoption of the digital health products and interventions? We had focused on clinical evidence for digital health products through a rapid, rigorous, consistent process. We can't wait 2 years to do an analysis and evidence evaluation. It needs to be rapid and it needs to be rigorous. What we have not considered and what is out of scope for this conversation is this is not meant for patients, caregivers, clinicians. It is not focused on diagnostic functions. And we recognize that there are other critical domains from the human factors, from data security and privacy that is not a part of it. We recognize it's important, but if we want to stay focused on clinical evidence, we have focused for the evidence defined and the target audience across the board, from decision makers on payers, PBMs, health systems, to even large pharmaceutical companies and medical societies across the board. So as we were defining digital health interventions for the E-defined, we looked at from 3 different criteria. Products that fall under one of the 3 classes on digital health technologies of digital health, medicine, and therapeutics, and the products that are defined to change one or more health behaviors. Lastly, the value that a product that this evaluator can drive towards improving a specific outcomes out of it was the 3 criteria that we looked at as a part of digital health intervention. Moving along, I'm going to pass over the ballot to Jordan to walk us through some of the gaps in the reasoning behind foundation of the evidence defined. Jordan, please.
Thanks, Smit. And stepping back just for a moment, it may be helpful to distinguish between 2 approaches to evidence standards in digital health. One approach asks what evidence will drive adoption, focused on business objectives. Another approach focuses on asking what evidence is really needed to support the goal of improving population health. And both of these orientations are perfectly valid. To help set the stage for this discussion, I will mention that evidence defined really focuses on the second approach here, asking what evidence is needed if your goal is to improve the health of a population. And it's actually my hope that over time, these 2 will continue to converge. Next slide, please. As we developed this framework, we did review 78 frameworks that had been proposed previously. And we identified 4 criteria for a useful framework in digital health evidence assessment. First, we sought evidence assessment frameworks that built on established best practices. So we're not wanting to reinvent the wheel. So we sought prior frameworks for digital health evidence assessment that leverage established evidence assessment best practices that had been developed for non-digital interventions. But of course, drugs and apps are different. And so we needed it to be the case that a framework had appropriate adaptation where appropriate. And specifically, we sought frameworks that address evidence quality criteria unique to digital health. I'll share more detail about that shortly. In addition, there are many evidence quality criteria where increased vigilance may be appropriate in digital health, given the regulatory context. And so we were looking for frameworks that highlighted areas where increased vigilance may be needed. And finally, we were looking for evidence assessment frameworks that really answer the question, so what? After you've completed an evidence quality assessment, what do you do with it? What are the implications with respect to product adoption decisions for a given level of evidence maturity? What degree of product adoption may be appropriate? And as shown, few frameworks satisfy these criteria. So we developed evidence defined in this context, and we really did our homework, candidly, looking at quite a few frameworks that had been proposed previously. Next slide, please. In that context, we think there are several important strengths of evidence defined. It does leverage established, rigorous evidence assessment methods. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel, but we are supplementing established methods to adapt as appropriate where there are unique considerations in digital health evidence assessment. Evidence defined also applies increased vigilance where needed, given the current regulatory context, and provides evidence to recommendation guidelines specifying what levels of adoption may be appropriate for each level of evidence quality. Next slide, please. So this one slide is the product of a substantial amount of expert input and development. And I want to highlight a few things about this evidence to recommendations guideline. First, it is a guideline, it is not gospel. And the enrollment guidelines, those targets, should have statistical justification. These are not exact. The overarching principle here is that the more mature the clinical evidence, the greater a level of adoption that may be appropriate, okay? So you'll notice that when there are earlier stage promising digital health technologies, this guideline does not say you cross them off the list until they've got 2 high quality RCTs. That's not the approach we take because we need innovation in healthcare and we need to be working with those earlier stage digital health technologies as well. But when a technology is at that stage, we may recommend a lower level of adoption as opposed to scaling up before the evidence has reached really a mature stage that would warrant widespread utilization. So this is the general approach, and we really invested a huge amount of effort in it, and we think it may be a helpful general strategy. Sorry, next slide, please. Evidence defined also incorporates key elements to achieve efficiency, including screening steps to avoid investing effort where adoption is not possible. And it also minimizes gathering of information that may have limited impact on adoption decisions. So for the first item here, as an example, if a given technology is not HIPAA compliant, then at least within our organization, it would not be a candidate for adoption, and so we wouldn't invest additional time in assessment. And regarding the second item here, this is analogous to the principle that we don't often want to run medical tests that are not going to change management. We want to understand if we're going to invest time in gathering a given piece of information, how might that impact adoption decisions? And we found that a lot of the information that is gathered may have limited impact on adoption decisions, so we minimize that. Next slide, please. Okay. With that, let me pass it back to Smit to begin describing these steps in the process.
Thank you, Jordan. And to be respectful of time, we are going to keep it very short. So what Jordan mentioned is we have compiled all the details into 4 simple steps. The starts with the screening. As Jordan mentioned, there are arenas and areas fit for purpose for every organization, what it means, having key privacy criteria like SOC compliance or software bill of materials that are critical that is existent, or there's a reading levels that comes out of a digital health products can be screened out by organizations. The second step is once those products have been screened out, then it's an application of establishment of methodologies that are designed for non-digital product. What we try to say is, as we are building and determining the level and ratings of the quality, use an established method that's being adopted. We are proposing a guide, which is the gradings of recommendation, assessment, development, evaluation, grade framework, which is a transparent framework. Clinical researchers have used it for multiple years that can help identify and rate some of the qualities. Jordan, would you like to share about step 3 and 4?
Next step is to apply the evidence-defined supplemental checklist that we developed. So this provides a list of evidence assessment considerations that may be unique to digital and/or areas where increased vigilance may be appropriate given regulatory context in digital health. Next slide, please. We'll share a few examples. I'll just mention one of these. Often, there are modifications implemented between the time a trial is run and the time that a digital health intervention is scaled up. And so that's something that should be investigated and evaluators should be aware of. There are quite a few other items in this supplemental checklist. Next slide, please. Finally, the 4th step is to make actionable recommendations by applying the evidence to recommendation guidelines shared a few slides ago. And let's put that up one more time, please. And that is the process in a nutshell. Next slide. Okay. with that, I think we're going to turn to our panel discussion.
Thank you, Jordan. Really appreciate that overview. And I think as you looked at evidence defined, one of the things we have tried to do as the whole team who has worked on this evidence defined is solidify a lot of this information into 4 simple steps that are action oriented and that practice from today. So without further ado, I would love to start. I have a lot of questions, and please, I'm monitoring the chat. If you have any questions, please feel free to do so. But I'll get started with, Tim, you have been with 3 organizations who have built digital therapeutic products for 3 different products, and you have seen evidence generation strategies from them. Paul, you have been advising some of the early stage innovation startups who are building, and Jenna, you lead one of them at one of the largest DTX organizations too. How and what have you seen in today's world, the need of those rapid, rigorous evaluations, and why is it needed to build the right evidence generation strategies and assessment criteria that helps broader adoption? Let's start with Tim, then Paul, and then go to Jenna.
Yeah, thank you, Smit. Yeah, I mean, my experience is just having worked at 3 different companies. I think we're generally oriented in the same direction, but certainly think about things differently at each place in terms of like, what is the right standard? What is the right way to approach this? And I think what excites me about what we've put together here and will continue to evaluate and update is the ability to have some consistency, something that we can all ground on and look to and hold up as a standard in this space as we mature and grow. So I think certainly that looms large, just having, from my diversity of experience at different, stops in my professional journey. I think the other thing about this that really is exciting to me is the fact that it feels more fit for purpose. It understands how it's supposed to be implemented and used, and really kind of is not trying to add more time or a barrier to people that are already overworked and tired to have to kind of go through something very big. Instead, it's intended to provide actionable insights of what should I do with this? How can I think about this? And how should I use this to inform how I might integrate this into my clinical practice or clinical care? So I really appreciate the way this is kind of meeting the moment and understanding the context in which it will be used.
Great. Yeah, and since leaving patients like me 4 years ago, I'm now an independent consultant, and I often work with people from sort of pre-C to Series B. And obviously, some of the most well-known organizations in this space were academic spin-outs with sort of a 20-year history of academic studies. So there's a big portfolio of stuff to sort of bring to bear. But what if you're a new intervention? What if you're a new technology? What if you're trying to leverage some technology in VR or on a smartphone or something like that that didn't exist 20 years ago? People think they just need to make the one perfect study to rule them all that will get published in the New England Journal of Medicine and solve all their problems, and they'll be on the front page of Time and have a TED talk and investors will flock to them. The challenge is, if they've never done that evidence generation at all, it's very unlikely that within their organization they actually have the procedures, the policies, the experience, the muscle memory to sort of do that. So what I encourage people to think about is a portfolio of evidence, right? And so at a very early stage, it might be about the usability, might be about the acceptability, might be these sort of smaller stage, say, iterations where version 1, hey, it didn't perform great, but we changed and here's what we learned to make a version 2, right? And so that is that whole body of evidence that we want to build up over time. It doesn't have to be slow, right? I'm a big advocate of things like preprints, of going to journals like the Journal of Medical Internet Research, where you don't have to explain what a smartphone is. Some of the traditional society journals seem to be a little bit allergic to digital health intervention. So, going to where people who are going to review it or read it are actually experts. And then I guess the third thing is, scientifically speaking, there has been a big push for registering your protocols, for pre-registering your statistical analyses in the world of pharma and the world of drug trials, right? Now, when you're in a move fast and get funded startup, that's a really difficult message to sell, particularly to your leadership, to your board, what have you. And so having an evidence-defined framework in place sort of says, well, look, these aren't just a suggestion. These aren't just a nice thing to do. These are increasingly the standards to which we have to be held. And I can imagine all of you on this call can think of examples where people seem to have, tortured the data and p-hacked and post-hocked and whatever to make these things come to light. And I'd say 4 or 5 years ago, maybe people weren't wise to it. But, it's really clear to say when we have frameworks like this that can help point out, where people are cutting corners and studies correctly, should yield the benefits of all that extra work. And I think that's appropriate. So yeah, hopefully we'll see an improvement in quality, and yeah, we'll be able to sort of make fairer evaluations really on some of these important issues.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with what Tim and Paul said. And I think, it as we kind of stated earlier, like it still is the Wild West in terms of frankly, like largely they're just being sort of weak evidence that is proposed as adequate. And so I think it's unlike for traditional medicine where the point at which any payer or any provider would be looking at evidence for a new drug, it already would be like at a sufficient level that it would have been FDA cleared. And so the bar, like the starting bar for reviewing evidence for more traditional medicine is just higher. And when in digital therapeutics and digital health, where some products might be under FDA regulation, but there's a lot of enforcement discretion still in that area. So and then there's some digital health that does not require any FDA regulation. And so either the point is it's just a much larger volume of products falling into that category without any kind of clear differentiator other than their evidence. And so I think that is why the need for a rapid framework, so that these different evaluators can quickly sift through those numerous different products to start to get to a short list of ones that should be seriously considered. So I do think that's very, very needed. And like I said, typically the problem is that the evidence is not robust enough, which is I think what everyone is alluding to. It's not having a pre-registered trial. That's just a scientific standard, right? And so by and large, I think this framework helps just to establish a minimum, evidence required. But there are some nuances as well that are, more about, well, what is, the fit for purpose or right amount of evidence for digital health or digital therapeutics. And that is, that's meaningful too. Understanding that there are some differences in how you should be thinking about or looking at evidence. So I think both of those are really two significant values for having something like this, in addition to the existing, kind of core evidence frameworks.
Jenna, I'm going to pick up on a thread that you alluded really nicely, is around there's a fit for purpose nature when it comes to the quality of the evidence and the evidence in itself, because products are different. They are targeted for different market. They are for different therapeutic areas, and there is a slight difference in that. And one of the really strong part of evidence defined is the quality of the evidence and the focus on quality of the evidence and evaluation. Group, I want to hear about why that matters, specifically on going into those depth and details. Jordan, let's start with you and go around the room.
Well, it matters because it may be the difference between a patient getting something that works and something that doesn't. And, the evidence quality details can be really important for determining what it is offering genuine clinical value. And we've seen over and over again that in digital health trials, you find things that you might not expect, for example, in a drug trial. And so you got to take a close look, and very often that makes a difference between adopting something that is likely to be effective and something that may not be. And because these interventions are so scalable that can impact many patients very quickly, And so those are some of the key considerations. Yeah.
May I chime in on that? I think I agree 100% with Jordan. I think it's very well said. And I was, I think that there's areas where there's just easy misconceptions, particularly for there's just a lot of new or different types of buyers or evaluators so I think they're not as familiar with some of these kind of standards. But for example, like one thing that I hear all the time is, it's just a presumption that a larger trial is always a better trial. And with digital, that's really interesting because you see people you can see these like real world or could be sort of could be a clinical trial, but not a rigorous RCT where there's 10,000 patients and it is not at all controlled or ultimately could have just other very significant design flaws that mean that you can't ascertain clinical efficacy or really from that trial, but they'll be used in that way, and the presumption from people reviewing it can be like, well, that's the best trial because it's 10,000 people versus like a rigorous RCT of 300. And so like those types of things I think are where this kind of framework can help. And it is, again, it's like something a little bit unique to digital because you never see like a 10,000 person drug trial that's like in the way that it might be used to presume efficacy. So just to kind of throw in that point.
Yeah. And maybe to add to what Jordan and Jenna were just saying, I think the other thing that looms large for me is we're still in the early days of understanding just like what drives the effects in digital interventions. And I think a lot about my own experience of just like, what I'll call a digital placebo effect of just like exposure to a smartphone and what just having that and having software on your device that you use, like, what does that look like? And what does that carry? And I think it's in one of the supplements, we talk about an example of a trial where if there wasn't a control condition, it would look like the treatment was doing something that ultimately the control condition was showing an equivalent effect. And so when I think about a lot of the origin of digital interventions that I think Paul mentions comes out of academic research, where just by the nature of grant funding, you're limited to, you can afford enough to build a first version of the app and maybe run a feasibility trial. And then over time, we lose sight of what was the design of the trial, and it's just the effect size that lives on. Like, oh, look at the robustness of this effect. And you kind of forget the fact that it came out of a 30-person open label study for 4 weeks, where like all of the things that would drive a inflated kind of effect size are there, but that kind of loses its, it doesn't stick with us. We kind of just get enamored with the effect and lose the sight of where that effect came from. What was the larger context? So I like the idea of us having something that, doesn't say like, you can't use this, but use this in a way that's consistent with the evidence and how that evidence was generated, so that we're not exposing people to unintended risks in terms of how we would roll that out and scale that evidence and grow that over time.
Yeah. No, and just to say, I think ultimately our goal for analyses, right, and to systematic reviews, and so that other people will be able to say, here are the studies that we should view in the round to understand how a mechanism of action is working on a particular group. But I think one of the things we do, particularly in that supplementary appendix, is point out some of the little red flags, loopholes, and just things to watch out for that might not be obvious to you if you're not really deep in this area. And amongst the many nuances of digital health is, if someone's published a paper in 2015 and 2020, what's the likelihood that a bunch of things haven't changed in that time? So 15-year-olds in 2015 and 15-year-olds in 2020, I would say, if we're talking about behavior, have changed a lot, right? If we're talking about the amount of technology and the resolution that's in their sensors, those have changed a lot, right? Cinemet has not changed since the 1970s. Dopamine receptors in Parkinson's haven't changed since the 1970s, right? So we are assuming a degree of continuity in some of the evidence from where, academic backgrounds have gone. And I think at this point, our role, our responsibility is to document in detail, make reproducible, and make systematizable the sort of evidence that we're producing, because ultimately it needs to be viewed in aggregate so that we can make broader broader assertions about our approaches. And I can foresee not too far off in the future, people essentially putting large data sets into repositories to allow other people in trusted data environments to come and run their code, right? To say, well, you went and did 50,000 people and this is the graph you've produced, but actually in our health system, we're interested in this subset. And so in parallel with your publication, I want to come and test some of your assumptions in a trusted health data environment. And so we need to have described our methods and our approach clearly enough to allow other people to come bring their notebooks and what have you, to come and test that out. Because ultimately, I think that the world in which the researcher that data and is also falling away in many other areas, and so it should for us as well, given the scale and scope of the types of users.
I'm going to jump in there as we get the microphone, which is a very nice question in the chat about, and I'm actually going to call out if Anita is somewhere close by where she can ask about the acceptance of your question.
Hi, so I was checking on one of the things, oops, hang on, we want to pull this down, you can't see me very well. All right, so bit of background, I'm very interested in digital health, and I lead the special interest group on digital health. And one of the things that we've been struggling with is about the evidence that comes that is not accepted because of individual requirements for different countries. So one of the things that I saw with the way that you're using GRADE, so GRADE talks about and as you've quite rightly pointed out, the design of the study and the robustness of the result. But what I was wanting to ask the group was, do you feel that that should be, so if we did a very good, robust study, which was out external to the situation or the setting in which you're currently considering, so it's a European study, and we're looking at US decision makers, are you expecting that that would be taken into account in GRADE? Would you accept that and therefore into defined, or would you have any comments on that?
Quite a few comments, and it's a great question, Anita. I'll ask other panelists to weigh in as well. Before I respond, I want to just clarify, when you're talking about lack of acceptance for a specific study, can you just say a little bit more about the context there, the kinds of scenarios that you've encountered?
So one of the problems for digital health innovators is the different requirements for different countries that have been put in place, and the need to show that there is sensitivity and specificity within the recipients that the particular decision maker is looking for. So obviously DIGA, everybody knows about these, like the Europeans, and then we have PCAN, something. So what's happening is, for these very small companies, often they're required to show, oh, but we need a trial, oh, but we need a trial, oh, but we need a trial, oh, but we. So somehow we've got to be able to balance the requirements that we would like to have in order to be able to make good uptake decisions with which is the whole reason we had ICH in the first place, right? The whole reason we do global pharmaceutical studies is because we can, because of ICH. Is there a way in which we can move towards that, or is that not possible? And I don't have the answer. I'm just interested in the panel's views.
Yeah, it's a great question. One approach is to say we can probably move toward that to some degree, but we may not be able to do the same kinds of things that are possible, for example, in drug trials, because let's say you are doing a trial of a novel statin. It's probably going to work more or less the same across different, say, cultures, whereas a digital therapeutic may not. A digital therapeutic where you are targeting behavior change as your mechanism of action may not work the same across different cultures in the way that a drug may be more likely to work the same across cultures. To me, it's really a question of generalizability. It's not that different from the same kinds of generalizability questions you might ask for other therapeutic modalities. And there may be some need to address case by case, for a given digital therapeutic that was trialed in one context, what's the level of risk for failure to generalize to another context that we might have interest in applying it? What do others think?
I think it's a great question. I think ultimately, it comes down to the specific intervention, and I think really to Jordan's point is what would likely vary across populations or cultures. And so for example, digital therapeutics at Big Health are based on principles of cognitive behavioral therapy, which have been very widely proven effective across cultures. But we also know where there are some differences in potentially one of them is like where specific symptoms manifest. Certain cultures would have more somatic presentation of symptoms versus more cognitive presentation of symptoms. And so it's not to say that we wouldn't think that this really a robust cognitive behavioral treatment proven effective in one culture would likely extend and be effective in another culture. But in that case, would we want to see a trial showing that that's true? Yes, because we know that there are some meaningful differences. And I would say related to that is this language. Like it is typical to do some evaluation of even just translation of a therapy to another language. And so I don't think you need the same level of rigor that you would for your preliminary trials typically, but you would want some feasibility research at a minimum, like showing that your adapted treatment is showing safety and efficacy. So, or it likely is generalizable to that population. So I think it's tricky, but I do think there are situations where absolutely you would want to push back on doing an additional trial. I mean, we have frequently been asked to do RCTs in minimally different populations, right? So for example, like a company might say to us, companies have said to us, well, I want to see an RCT in my employee population in the US specifically, and we'll say, we've done 40, clinical trials, including numerous RCTs in English-speaking, US-speaking populations with thousands of participants. Like there is absolutely no legitimate reason to do an RCT in this population. So now you want to do something to show proof of concept for your implementation and uptake in that population, things like that, which is not not a clinical trial. So I think that you would get some mix of those as you're trying to extend across countries and cultures, but it is so by and large, I think this type of framework works very well across cultures. But it's a great call out, and I don't know if anyone else wants to chime in on that.
No, just to say, I agree with what you just said, Jenna. I think is well stated. And the only other thing I'll add is, when we think about this framework across cultures, the other thing that looms large, I think, for us building digital therapeutics is just that there is inconsistency in just like the clearance pathways across countries and across different. And so I think as we think about evidence standards and aligning that, within a country with kind of what the regulatory guidance is and how we would bring something through that process, thinking about how those things move together is another consideration I'll put on the table. I don't have the answer, but it's something that is certainly top of mind as we think about kind of the portability and the ability to take this and expand this beyond or across different regions.
Yeah, one of the things that might be of interest is the Wellcome Trust's mental health priority area, which has been researching what they call active ingredients, which I guess would be like mechanisms of action, and they are somewhat agnostic about the means of delivery. So it's quite possible that, say, in the US, things might be delivered by a native smartphone app, whereas in other parts of the world doing that via SMS or via WhatsApp as a delivery mechanism might be functionally the same thing in terms of what that person's experiencing, right? And so sometimes when we talk about the digital mental health or the digital health intervention, we've got to understand how much of the stack do we need to evaluate, right? How much of it is core and how much of it is just peripheral or just a delivery mechanism?
All fantastic insights, and really appreciate Anita the question. There's also a couple of questions that I'm going to summarize on individuals' behalf from Jessica and Todd. Really interesting in terms of how and or why did we think about utilizing best practices from non-digital health intervention products and this scale that helps us build on evidence-defined. Any takes on there?
For me, it comes back to not reinventing the wheel. There are excellent evidence assessment methodologies that have been developed over the course of many years with input from numerous experts. Those frameworks have been improved iteratively already. Doesn't make sense, in my opinion, to reinvent the wheel. It's just, I think, a much more logical approach to adapt existing best practices. What do others think?
Yeah, I mean, I had the same thought, not reinventing the wheel. I think where we can learn from past efforts and use that to kind of fit with our understanding of what the problem was as we were thinking of this. As good scientists, you're always trying to learn from the people that came before you to understand how we can use that to the problem we're tackling. So completely agree, Jordan.
And lastly, that helps us do it in a rapid and rigorous way in terms of, we talked about the need to do it rapidly and evaluation rapidly. That does not take 6 months to evaluate a product. Rather, it shortens the time frame to do that. And if we're building on the best practices, that might suit onto it. I know we are cognizant of time, but I want to give an opportunity to all members. What is one takeaway you have been working, when I say you, in the industry, in the field, building some of the products, evaluating some of the products, and also building this framework with us on evidence-defined? What takeaway do you want to take that you want to share with learners, audience today? I wouldn't say learners.
We only get one?
Choice is yours, Jordan.
If I only get one, read the methods section. How about others?
I mean, picking up on that, I like that one, Jordan. I was going to say, I think the table 2 in the supplement is actually incredibly helpful to ground in. It's the quality section. And there's examples which I think are incredibly helpful to kind of ground in the level of like nuance that you want to be looking for, and like what's unique to digital that might not be the same in other types of medicine. So that would be one. And I think, and I would say that, oh shoot, only one. Sorry. Okay. Onward.
Let's do 2, Jenna, and then we'll pass on.
2, it's too hard. Just to say that I do, I mean, I think that, look, said this earlier, but the problem is still insufficient evidence, insufficient quality of evidence, I should say. And so like the biggest thing we can do is basically just to be advocating for high quality evidence, period, in digital health. This type of a framework helps that education awareness, simplifies it, but like really like the extent that we can all go out and share that message is better. We want to get people, it's going to do such a credit to the field and really help patients more and more if we can just continue to kind of pass that information along.
I think for me, to bring it back to kind of what I said in my intro, it's consideration of stage of development and really thinking about the evidence needs that's commensurate with kind of your understanding of what you're building and kind of your confidence in what you're building, and really being able to, we all want to have the gold standard evidence that comes with a fully realized treatment, but we have to start somewhere, and the ability to kind of ask the right questions and methodically approach how you can iteratively develop and use data to make the treatment more efficacious or safer for people, and understanding like what is the right context and the right level of dissemination and scoping around that. I think this framework does a great job of kind of giving us a gradient where it's not just a binary, it's no evidence or all the evidence. It's like it's the evidence in between that allows us to de-risk and pull that product forward.
Yeah, I think my takeaway is that if we want all these interventions to have good studies, we as a community need to think about putting more infrastructure in place. Investment into new startups has gone down substantially in the past 6 to 8 months. That money, that investment could have been used for high quality evidence, right? I think one of my nerd crushes from the COVID era is platform trials, right? Trials like Recovery for COVID very quickly ruled in dexamethasone, very quickly ruled out hydroxychloroquine, but we didn't wind down that infrastructure until we had those learnings. And it feels like there's a massive opportunity here in an area like mental health, in an area like obesity or something like that, to set up infrastructure platforms so that each of these companies is not raising $10 million and then spending $8 million of it trying to do evidence and then running out of capital by the time their publications come out to get a pilot. That dog don't hunt in the current economic climate, right? So if we don't just want these folks to just disappear and become unviable, there's a broader group of people that have to create some infrastructure to let these people plug into. Otherwise, everybody just building their own infrastructure for one study, then spinning it back down again is inefficient and burns a lot of heat, burns a lot of cash.
Absolutely. I think those are some great points, Paul. If I could go beyond just one to mention a few other things, I would say that if you're a digital health solutions provider, you might want to be aware that evidence standards may be increasing over time. And when you design your trial, you should know that the standards today may not be the same as the standards that will be in place a year or two in the future when results are available. If you're developing a digital health product, you may want to peruse that evidence to recommendations gradient, that rubric, and keep in mind that principle that higher quality evidence may justify higher levels of product adoption. Consider getting honest assessments. There are a lot of details to address, but consider if you're developing an evidence generation strategy, consider getting honest assessments from internal and external experts. Call people like Paul Wicks, and then when he recommends something, take his recommendations seriously. Last thing I'll mention is that I would encourage developers of digital health products to consider generating evidence in underserved patient groups. Almost all the vendors we talk to, they're saying a lot about health equity, but few have solid evidence in underserved populations. And so that's a real gap that we're very, very interested in seeing filled.
Thank you, Jordan, and thank you, everyone. I think this is not just only a tremendous work group who has produced a framework that is going to change and become one of the new standard of excellence as we think about evaluating evidence. But essentially, this is so easy to put into practice. And as an ecosystem, if everyone starts putting into practice, the whole ecosystem and community will have greater evidence coming out for digital health products, and we can drive the field forward. So with that, in the next 60 seconds or so, let's do some what's coming next. So if you have not had a chance to look at the evidence-defined framework, please do so in Nature Digital Medicine. DIME has a new web page of all accessible resources, all different 78 frameworks turned into Airtables and checklists that you can use that is accessible. And please let us know what do you think, how you're using it, and we would love to learn from you as you're using these frameworks so that we can implement some of the newer best practices. talking about the same, the next effort from DIME is thinking about integrated evidence plan. How do we align evidence across various different stakeholders, from regulatory to commercial success, and optimizing the best outcome that the patients can have? So please join us in this endeavor. We would love to welcome you. And then next week, we have a very interesting and a very exciting webinar that's coming up. Troy Tazbaz, the new director from FDA's Digital Center of Excellence, will be joining us alongside Marissa Roche and Jen Goldsek, talking about how to build fit-for-purpose regulatory strategy as it relates to a good business strategy, and what are some of the success metrics, how to implement some of the right regulatory strategies that advances business. So please tune in for that. Alongside next month, our work group at Impact is launching some of the very exciting resources on navigating reimbursement for virtual first care. So thinking about care delivery systems and the reimbursement that goes with it, led by our colleague here, Abby, Dr. Silva, Lucia, Dr. Vega, and Don Jones, on a very interesting conversation. So hope to see you there. Last but not the least, I want to thank Jordan Silverman for his leadership on leading this entire work group at Evidence Define, speakers from today's who have shared so many great insights. And I also see some of the call Madalena, Isaac, and Alicia as well joining us. So thank you for joining us today. Please let us know how you're doing, and have a wonderful rest of your day.